Well, hello, everyone. My name's Lesley Riddoch. I'm sort of Scottish. You'll hear from my accent. I was brought up in Belfast. To my annoyance, I was born in Wolverhampton, which means I can't get an Irish passport. And today, with Andy Murray's emotional moments this morning, I'm feeling very Scottish, actually. This session is called The Strange Passions of Brexit, and it's looking at what has got into the English. Now, that sounds unnecessarily sort of barbed and perhaps even racial at the sides of it, but clearly something different has been happening north and south of the border, and this is a wee exploration of what that is. You could actually chuck in something about the strangeness that's got into the Scots too, because I'm an independent supporter. Joanna Cherry, who was here this morning, also supports, obviously, Scottish independence. And Alan Smith, the MEP that will be on the next panel, is also a member of the SNP and supports Scottish independence. What the heck are we doing here? And this is not just because, Scotland needs us up the road. This is because there's a strong belief that the worse Brexit gets, the better the prospects for Scottish independence become. So I would suggest there's a wee clue in there somewhere, either about the strangeness of us as people, or some kind of culture, political culture that has been working for a while in Scotland that keeps trying to look at the greater good and has been trying to find its way out through the bits of devolution we control. That too might just sound a wee bit too pompous for its own good. And please, when it comes to your questions, feel free to knock that around. But let's start off with our two extremely esteemed guests here. We have Fintan O'Toole beside me, who obviously writes for the Irish Times, The Guardian. The Guardian, and needless to say, has written that fabulous book about heroic failure, and clearly is one of your favourite journalists when it comes to all of this. I imagine you'd get the same hero's roar from Anthony Barnett, who is our next speaker. Who helped get this whole thing together, is a founder of Open Democracy and wrote a book, The Lure of Greatness, which is where I met him at the Edinburgh Book Festival a couple of years ago, when it seemed that the thoughts he had about the democratic deficits that riddle British, and let's sort of get it more specific in some ways, English society, that some of these unfairnesses and inequalities have been working their way through Brexit, and that seems to be so clearly true now. So let me start off with Fintan, however. The strange passions of Brexit, what has got into the English as opposed to the Scots, the Northern Irish, and you could tackle the Welsh if you're feeling strong enough.
I'm going to leave the Welsh alone. So I suppose, first of all, when we use the term the English, I would want to say that I know there are multiple Englands. Another England is possible, as well as the one that we're seeing expressing itself in Brexit. But I think if you want to look at the reactionary Englishness, which I think has driven Brexit, I don't think it's too mysterious, really. I started writing the book that I did in July when Boris Johnson resigned, as he was always going to do, when any prospect of taking responsibility for anything might arise. And if you remember, he wrote this extraordinary self-pitying and self-dramatizing letter to Theresa May, but it said, the Brexit dream is dying. And I was kind of thinking, in the west of Ireland, on holidays, I was thinking, what the hell is the dream? What's the dream world that Brexit comes out of? And, this may seem very abstract in a way, but,
You're Irish.
structures, yeah, exactly, we know all about this stuff. W.B. Yeats invented Harlem, so, the dream world matters. It sort of creates a structure of feeling that's kind of mobilized, I think, through Brexit. And I think it's defined by an extraordinary self-pity. How does a prosperous, successful, modern Western European democracy which has all sorts of problems, as everybody else does, but is nonetheless, if you look around the world, is in a pretty privileged position, come to imagine itself as being intolerably oppressed? And that's the real question we have to answer. So there is a sort of willed masochism in the whole thing, that you have to say, we were dominated, we were taken over, we were controlled, we have no power, we have submitted ourselves to the European Union, we were pulled into it under false pretenses. It's really a German plot to achieve by peaceful means what they couldn't achieve in the war And this stuff is surreal, it is ridiculous. But what you have to do then is, I'm sort of suggesting in a way, there's a kind of, we all thought imperialism was over. I mean, even in Ireland, we thought British imperialism was over a long time ago, But it turns out there's a last stage of empire, which is the zombie stage, where zombies, of course, eat brains, which you should also remember. But the zombie stage is one in which, having taken everything else from your colonies, having taken all the resources and all the power, you take the suffering. You take onto yourself the idea that not only were you not really an imperial power, but you were really colonized. And this has a serious history. I mean, it goes back to Enoch Powell in the Rivers of Blood speech, talking about, the invasion of dark-skinned people. But it also, this really starts to take off in the early 1990s. Anthony's written brilliantly about this. I would really very strongly recommend his book, which I know is for sale outside. But Anthony's written brilliantly about this, that moment in 1990 with German reunification, And Anthony asked the question, which is, why was Britain not claiming this as a great victory? Why was the British Prime Minister not out on the Berlin Wall saying, the Second World War is finally over, this is a great achievement for the British people, which it is and should be. And instead, it's this paranoid reaction which says, oh, the Germans really won, they're back. And you have, I don't know if a lot of you might have read, brilliant, Robert Harris's brilliant thriller, Fatherland, which kind of starts, and Harris writes very explicitly, he says, this is a reaction to German reunification. Let's imagine the Germans really won the war. And let's imagine that Britain is a kind of colony of Germany. And you've got SSGB, the Len Dayton series. You've got, there's a whole series of these things of kind of imagining we lost the war. And it's a way really of going into a sort of self-pity. And then what you have to remember is it's also very camp. It's like sort of Nazi camp, because it has very serious consequences, but it's played out as farce. It's played out as farce. What is the oppression? How do you imagine yourself to be oppressed? Well, you look around and you say, well, the European Union is really boring. I really don't want to read a lot of news about it, but that's not oppression. I mean, oppression is if you've ever experienced it, is kind of serious, enslavement, colonization, all of these kinds of terms that get into the mentality that leads to Brexit. And then you have to start inventing ways in which you're oppressed. You have to start inventing, and of course the British tabloid press has done this for 25 years, drip, drip, drip. They're stopping our fishermen, or they're making our fishermen wear hairnets. They are, and I have a whole chapter about the history of the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp and its role in Brexit. Boris's first campaign was to save the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp from the Euro-Nazis who were trying to stop good English parents from feeding their children prawn cocktail flavoured crisps. So the invention of oppression.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm seeing most people here laughing along with what you're saying, and yet I imagine most people in this room are English. So let me check that out. How many people are English in this room? That is most people, all the grumblers, right? So the thing is, have they got the virus?
No, and I really want to stress this. So I'm not talking about, that's why I said, the English is a problematic term. And in fact, in a way, the problematic nature of the English as a term, and I'm sure Anthony will talk about this because he's written brilliantly about it, which is, let's start by saying England is a country. It's a proud country. It's a country which has an enormous amount to be proud about. It's a country I've admired all my life. It's a country to which most of my parents' families emigrated by choice because it was a better place to live than Ireland in the 1950s and 1960s. The National Health Service, the educational opportunity, the fact that you could join a trade union and you could have some kind of protection in your job. These are national achievements to be incredibly proud about. English literature, English drama, English poetry, English creativity, So England as an entity, as a political community, is just as valid and legitimate as anybody else's, And so the idea that Englishness has to be associated with reactionary, far-right, neo-fascist, knee-jerk stuff is wrong. But the problem is that if you don't have a positive, optimistic expression of Englishness, which actually says, you know what, our National Health Service is one of the great achievements of human civilization, which it is. It's better than the pyramids, it's better than the Sistine Chapel. If you don't have that, then you leave that space to be occupied by these dark fantasies. So the dark fantasies only come in the absence of a much more positive way of talking about Englishness. And this is one of the reasons to be optimistic. I know this is a really optimistic day, upbeat, but Brexit is displacement activity. It does not deal with the issues, any of the issues that drive it, but one of those issues being the issue of an unarticulated English identity. It's not dealt with by Brexit, because where does Brexit go? The precious, precious union, back into all the same kind of stuff again. So there is still an enormous amount to be dealt with, I think, in terms of how English people see themselves collectively. And I don't think the only definition of Englishness is the camp, ridiculous, surreal joke that is Jacob Rees-Mogg. I mean, I actually think there's a better Englishness than that.
Great. So, Anthony, I mean, you've been sitting listening to all that, thinking, no doubt. So what do you want to say?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say, apart from thanking Henry and saying this is a fantastic day to put this on at such short notice, is that I think it's a sign of the fact that we're all changing. And it's something that Henry himself has said. We're all changing. Brexit is changing us internally. At first, people felt it wasn't going to happen, or it wasn't really real, it wasn't really serious. And now I think something quite deep and significant is going on inside all of us, Remainers. I thought that Caroline Lucas's speech, where she was talking about we're changing and we're listening, was a very important sort of orientation of the people's vote not to go back to the past. And there's a passage in Fintan's being very nice about my book, but his book is also a wonderful book to be read, of heroic failure. And there's a passage at the beginning where he says that when the UK joined the European Union, at the debate began at the end of the 60s and joined in the early 70s, then the referendum in 75, it wasn't experienced as a collective success, as the expression of a collective will of the country to join the European Union. It was experienced as the surrender of will to join. And I think one of the things that we need to debate is why, given the ridiculous nature of Brexit, it has been permitted to succeed. And I think part of the reason for that is that the ruling order which took us in to the European Union, or was then the Common Market, the EC, sort of it wanted to retain, you can still hear this in where Blair speaks, we should be there for our power and influence. So it's like the European Union is second best to being top dog. There was a kind of sadness to it from those who took us in. It was seen always instrumentally rather than something which was an expansion of what we are. Now, I think most people here would feel themselves to be European citizens. Is that right? Sorry. Is that yes? Is that a yes? I can't, I'm very bad. Is that a yes? Okay. Now, I know various Europeans, Greek Europeans, they're Greek. They're Europeans, they're passionately for Europe, but they're for being Greek as well, or Italians. The Spanish, who feel they're very Spanish and European. French I have a very good German friend, he's a passionate European, but he wouldn't deny being German. So being European means being something else, being Irish European, being Scottish European. Being European enhances, if I think I'm right in saying, what it means to be Irish, to be Scottish, to be German. Well, if we want to be Europeans, we have to be something else as well. Europe is not a superstate trying to get rid of nations. It enhances what it means to be a European nation. It's a new way of being a European nation. It builds, it takes down walls, it makes us more, not less. So we have to be European citizens. That, yes, means we have to be something else as well. That's what it's about. And so part of the question we have to face is, are we British Europeans or are we English Europeans? Now, we can be both, but we can be English Europeans. And that starts to produce a positive energy between these two things, not a negative one. And I think part of the problem, the last thing I'll just say at this point, is one of the problems about being British European is that Britain, from the Act of Union, has been an imperial entity. It's a multinational entity. And it's a very ancient one with a very sort of complex, uncodified constitution, which is now trying to preserve. You can see this in the way Theresa May and Parliament trying to keep the show on the road. The European Union is a very young, codified, constitutionalizing, multinational process. So for these two things to be one in the other, just psychologically, there's going to be a kind of a contradiction, a tension between them. The European Union process is a threat to an uncodified constitutional entity. And so Britishness is in a certain way incompatible with being part of the European Union at the constitutional level, not at the cultural level at all. I mean, I regard Fintan as part of, there's a part of him which is part of British culture. The way you write about English literature means that there's something shared between us and the same. So there is a tension there, and you can see it because although, this is a kind of paradox, although all the figures, all the statistics, all the voting shows that Brexit was driven by what I call England without London, 11% majority in the referendum, that strange entity, the English vote for Brexit was a vote for Britain. It's the B in Brexit. It wasn't a vote for England. It was a vote by the English, but not for the English or of the English in that existential way. So there's a way in which being for Britain, Great Britain, global Britain, is an alternative to, is seen as a kind of alternative to being part of this, that new, modern, constitutionalizing, sharing sovereignty of Europe. So I think being English Europeans, whether we have a federal Britain at the end or whether, as Joanne Cherry said, we have England and Scotland side by side in the European Union, very important thing to say to an audience like this. First time I ever heard it, I didn't think I would hear it in this country so soon. Whichever, whether it's federal or whether it's independent, we've got to be English Europeans, and that's the positivity that will make this, when we really become Europeans, part of our collective energy and collective will, not something that we're subjugated to.
I just want to ask one question, and then please fire in with as many questions as you can. And I think we'll take them in clumps of 3 so we can get through as many questions as possible. But, you know, thinking about the different responses, maybe it doesn't really help us too much to kind of start to try and to mine the identities that sit around the table here. But the Scots seem to regard the establishment as Westminster. If there's a difficulty with the establishment, not all Scots, but quite a lot of Scots are immediately thinking they know who that is, and it's sitting kind of close to here. Whereas the folk who have got a problem with the establishment in a lot of England, and maybe particularly the north of England, are not automatically thinking about the structures of Westminster, the fact that they haven't got regional assemblies, the fact that there's no proportional representation, the fact that this is an extremely archaic political system. They're immediately somehow so easily tilted towards directing all of that towards Europe. Now, what is going on there that across Hadrian's Wall, there seems to be such a different immediate thought as to where the establishment lie?
Right, well, I think it's a very, very good question. I think the immediate answer to it is that the Scots have a sense that there is a Britain and England, that they're in competition. So they're in a triangle. And there's Europe, there's England, Britain, and there's Scotland. And so they see, they believe, they understand Westminster, the Anglo-British, as a political force. I think, not just in the north of England, there is now a complete loss of belief in the Westminster system. The House of Lords, the cronies, the corruption, the pomposities of it. Nobody really believes in their effectiveness. They're all telling us that government is bad. And what Fintan said about displacement activity, driven by the press, people are being told they don't really believe these guys are responsible for anything or could even open a paper bag, so they blame Europe.
But why?
So it's out of a weakness. But there's a lack of belief in this country now, having gone from a very strong belief that we know how to govern ourselves to a sense that these people are useless, and so we blame the European Union for our condition.
But really, let me just try one more time. But why? Because you have put that so powerfully. If that's true, and I don't know if that is a shared belief, that so many people now do think that the structure of Westminster is pretty hopeless, is it? Right, so why is it then that it's so easy to swap people to not tackle that and tackle the ideas of Europe instead? Is it that these parts of Westminster feel that they're integral to English identity?
I think there's something going on which is saying we're being undermined, lack of self-belief. The European Union is encouraging this process. If we kick them out and kick everybody, then in the pain, sort of spirit of the Blitz, self-belief will return.
Okay, I can hear all the rumbling, so put that into questions, right? Okay, where are we? And where's the folk with the microphones, so I just see where you're close? Can you get the gentleman that's close to you over there? The lass in the middle? Can you look back at me, lass, with the microphone? Have you got one? Yes, let's go to the lassie. Sorry, I'm going all Scottish on you. There. And where have we got another microphone? At the back. Somebody near the back? Can you come down to the front a bit then? Run, run, run. And get whoever's on the extreme. Oh, there, we've got another microphone. That person there. Okay, where were we at the start? Yourself, sir.
Do we think that Brexit is a kind of national humiliation we have to go through, equivalent to being invaded or losing the war or something of that stature that happened to a lot of other European countries? And the narrative is that plucky Brits won it on our own. And do we have to go through that, and maybe with the zombie stage of that? What can end that process?
Okay, thanks. Yes, down here.
I love the irony of it being an Irish journalist telling us how bad this is, and I hope Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg appreciate that, seeing as they think so much of Ireland. My question is about diplomacy. So for the last 20 years, we've had the best diplomacy and diplomatic relations between the UK and Ireland, and now that's at rock bottom. We talked a lot this morning about how we repair the divisions in this country. How are those divisions in diplomacy between the UK and Ireland going to be repaired after we hopefully have a people's vote, and also across Europe, because everybody looking on at this country thinks it's gone mad?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, and over there.
How does the panel explain the fact that we have no real opposition in this country, that Corbyn and the leadership of the Labour Party have got this fantasy of socialism in one country, his version of Brexit? What kind of British identity where does that come from?
Right, okay, so we've got is the national humiliation of Brexit necessary? Do we have to go through this? The question about diplomacy between the UK and Ireland, will it ever recover? How will it recover? And Britain's status across Europe. And also that question about no real opposition, which was cunningly woven in a sort of identity-ish kind of way. So, right, Fintan.
So on the first question, do you have to go through it before you can realize how bad it is? It's a question of imagination, isn't it? Bernard Shaw, in St. John, there's a great line where Joan says, must a Christ be crucified in every generation to save those who have no imagination? Do you have to experience the job losses, the implosion of communities, the pain that ordinary people are going to suffer? Does that have to be done in order to understand what it is that you're doing? Or could you not just imagine it? I mean, I don't know if anybody's a fan of Westworld. You know, could you not do a sort of no-deal Westworld, kind of virtual no-deal, you know, where you just went and had a kind of, you know. But of course, the fundamental problem here, which we always have to face, is that the people who are going to suffer the pain are not the people who are claiming that the suffering of that pain will be morally good. You know. One of the great additions to my home city of Dublin in recent times, of course, has been 2 hedge funds, you know, run by Jacob Rees-Mogg, explicitly explaining to their investors that they're moving to avoid the worst effects of Brexit. You know, Nigel Lawson, you know, has become a permanent resident of France. I mean, Farage has his children have German citizenship. You know, I mean, was it Anna Soubry said these people have the golden lifeboats? You know, so in a way, they don't have to imagine the pain because they're never going to suffer it. You know, Nick Cohen has talked about I'm a newspaper columnist. I mean, newspaper columnists, my career's done really well out of Brexit, thanks very much. You know, I mean, as I'm sure, you know, Boris Johnson is not going to be paid less than his $280,000 a year for writing the same column every week in the Telegraph. You know, these people benefit from the chaos. And so the real question is, who can articulate for the people who are really going to suffer what it is they're going to suffer? And that's where the gentleman's question about opposition, I think, is absolutely at the heart of it. The people who should be speaking to working class communities is the Labour Party. You know, and it has to begin with the moral imperative of trying to protect the people that you serve from harm. You know, that's what you start with. Playing these games and imagining somehow that there's a utopian socialism at the other side of a disaster is historically illiterate, apart from everything else. On the other side of these disasters lies fascism, historically. On the other side of these disasters lies an authoritarian breakdown of community. There is no left-wing socialist case for putting people through a disaster so that they disengage from the current set of structures. Sorry, I went on too long. I'll just briefly try to address the question about Britain and Ireland. One of the disgraceful tragedies of Brexit is that it was over. In 2011, Queen Elizabeth came to Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. It was the first time in exactly a century that a British monarch could go across the Irish Sea to the nearest neighbour. That's how bad, you know, our mutual relationship has been. And when she was there, I didn't care about it. I didn't give a damn. I don't care about Queen Elizabeth. But it turned out to be incredibly moving and incredibly important. Why? Because there were 200 people on the streets protesting. 200 people was as much as anybody could get out to say, we hate Britain, go home. Everybody else was saying, isn't this great? We're just neighbours now. It's over. 700 years of stuff is over. And it was over because the Northern Ireland troubles were over. It was over because the things that were driving it were over. And these were over. And this goes back to Anthony's critical point about relationships on these islands have been transformed by the experience of being together in the European Union. You know, this is not abstract. You know, just a very finally point. You know, this is not abstract. It's not about saying, wouldn't it be great if we could all have our Europeanness and it could help us to come together. It's already happened on one of the 2 islands. You know, European citizenship, European identity is what has transformed our island. And to simply, ignore that is disgraceful. The last point, when I say this, everybody thinks I'm making it up. But
you're too right. It's
okay.
the last one now.
When I cross the border now, the only way I know I'm crossing the border is my mobile phone pings with a message from my mobile phone company, and it says, "You are now roaming in Europe."
Right. Okay, Anthony, on those ones?
Very briefly, I think the first point about do we have to see Brexit as something that we suffer is you could argue, I think it's a very important way, that this is a good crisis. That this is a crisis we have to go through, and that we can turn this into something which is positive. There's been a challenge to the way we govern ourselves, which is long overdue. It's come about in a very bad and horrible way, but let's make the best of it. And this brings me to my answer to this question where you skillfully brought in the role of the opposition into this discussion of where we're at. And the thing that astonishes me is this: I can understand why, given in the Leave areas that are Labour areas, that they're very nervous about trying to say, we've got to go somewhere else. But take back control should be a socialist slogan. It should be a Labour slogan. And this is an opportunity for an opposition to say, the way this country is governed, we want to democratize our economy. You can't democratize our economy without democratizing our politics. They should be building on the democratic element that was exploited in the referendum to say, right, Labour's going to transform the whole constitutional settlement of this country. What a radical opportunity could be seized. They could build on this moment, not just to say, we're against Brexit, let's go back. This is an enormous opening. And one of the difficulties when Caroline Lucas was speech this morning was a speech that should have been given by the leader of the opposition. And for me, she is